I wasn't supposed to hear it. The house was quiet, the kind of late-night silence where every sound feels amplified, every creak of the floor like a gunshot in the dark. I had just gotten up for a drink, bare feet brushing against the cold tile, when I heard his voice. Low, controlled, but there was something underneath it, something I wasn't ready for. I froze. The kitchen light was off, but just around the corner, a sliver of golden glow spilled from the slightly open door of the study. His voice again. A name. Not mine. Hers. My pulse jumped. I shouldn't have stayed. I should have walked back to my room, shut the door, and drowned myself in sleep. But my body refused to move. I inched forward, pressing my back against the wall, barely daring to breathe. The words were clearer now. I think about it every night. Silence. Then her voice, soft, hesitant but not denying. You shouldn't. A sharp exhale. A chair shifting. My stomach twisted. This wasn't just some late-night conversation. I could feel the tension pushing against the air, the kind that changes things. I peered through the crack in the door. Him. Sitting on the edge of the desk, head tilted slightly down, hands clenched into fists on his thighs. His jaw tight. His body stiff. But his eyes were locked on her. And her, standing a few feet away, arms wrapped around herself like she was holding something in, like she was trying to keep herself from stepping closer. I swallowed hard. This was wrong. I shouldn't be seeing this. But I couldn't look away. She shifted, biting her lip, the hesitation in her stance colliding with the undeniable pull between them. Then his voice again, low, raw, breaking apart at the edges. Tell me you don't feel it too. A breath hitched. Hers. A second passed. 2. Then she turned, too fast, like she needed to escape the moment before it swallowed her whole. The door creaked open wider as she moved, and for the briefest second, his eyes lifted and landed on me. Everything inside me stopped. His gaze didn't waver, didn't flick away in shock or guilt. He just stared, and I felt it, like I just stepped into something I could never step out of again. Silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. I should have run, should have pretended I saw nothing. But the weight of his stare held me there, locking my feet to the floor. She didn't notice at first. Her back was to me, her hands gripping the doorframe like she needed something solid to keep herself steady, like she was already unraveling. Then she turned, and she saw me. Her breath caught, eyes widening, shock, fear, something else flickering behind them. I felt it like a jolt to my chest. I wasn't meant to be part of this. I expected her to say something, to deny what I had just seen. But she only swallowed, the movement visible along the line of her throat. Her fingers curled into the wood, knuckles whitening. I finally moved, stepping back, but too late. He stood. Slowly. Deliberately. I barely heard the scrape of the chair against the floor over the pounding in my ears. My body was hypersensitive, catching every flicker of movement, the way his shoulders squared, the way his fingers flexed at his sides before he took a step forward. I mirrored him, stepping back again. His voice came low, controlled, but there was an undercurrent of something dangerous. How much did you hear? I tried to speak. Nothing came out. She turned away, exhaling hard, like she couldn't bear to face this moment. My mouth was dry. Enough. His lips parted slightly at that. Not quite a reaction, but something in his expression shifted. A flicker of realization. I could feel it now, the electric pull that had been in that room before I walked in, the thing I had only glimpsed through the crack in the door. It was here now, lingering in the space between the three of us, refusing to be ignored. She moved first, breaking the moment, stepping toward me as if she could smooth this over. But she stopped short. Too close. I caught the faint scent of her perfume, something subtle but intoxicating, and suddenly I couldn't not notice her. The way the soft fabric of her robe clung to her frame, the nervous way her fingers curled into the sleeve, the way her breath, uneven now, mixed with mine in the charged space between us. His gaze burned into us both. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. I won't say anything. A simple promise. But the air didn't settle. If anything, the tension wrapped tighter, pressing into my ribs, making it harder to breathe. Because the problem wasn't words. It was the way my pulse reacted to them, the way I couldn't stop looking at her, and the way he noticed. The silence stretched too long, thick with something undeniable. She exhaled a shaky breath and dropped her arms to her sides. Her fingers twitched like she wanted to reach for something. But what? Him? Me? I didn't want to know. I turned to go to break free from whatever this was, but he moved first. His hand, strong, warm, closed around my wrist. Not tight, not forceful. Just enough. Enough to stop me. Enough to send a sharp current through my veins. Enough to make her inhale sharply. I froze. So did he. I felt his pulse against my skin. A steady, slow drumbeat that didn't match my own. His fingers should have let go. He should have released me the second he realized what he'd done. But he didn't. His thumb brushed against the inside of my wrist. So slight, so fleeting, I could have imagined it. But I didn't. And she saw it. A flicker of movement in my periphery. She took a half step forward, lips parting as if she wanted to say something. But no words came. Something shifted then. It wasn't just me. It wasn't just him. It was all three of us. Tangled in something neither of us had the words for. The air was too thick, too warm, pressing against my skin, making it hard to think. I forced myself to move, to break the moment before it swallowed me whole. I pulled my wrist back and this time he let go. But not before I felt it. The hesitation. His. Mine. Hers. A slow exhale from him, the sound heavy, filled with something unspoken. Then, finally, his voice, quiet but loaded with meaning. You should go. I didn't argue. I turned, forcing myself to move, to walk away like none of this happened. Like I hadn't just stepped into something I could never step out of again. I reached the hallway. My breath was shallow, my pulse erratic. The moment I stepped past the doorframe, it felt like the air rushed back in, slamming into me, making me realize just how close I'd been to something I wasn't ready for. But just as I thought I was free, I heard it. Her voice, barely above a whisper. What have we done? And his answer, quiet, raw, but without hesitation. I don't know. But I don't want to stop. I closed my eyes. And I knew then this wasn't the end. It was only just beginning. The night should have ended there. I should have gone back to my room, pulled the covers over my head, and let the darkness swallow what I had seen. But I didn't. I couldn't. My body moved before my mind could stop it, my feet dragging me down the hallway away from the study, only to pause, hover, hesitate just outside my own door. Something pulled at me. A feeling. A presence. And when I turned my head, he was there, standing just a few feet away, watching me. I sucked in a sharp breath, but I didn't back away. His eyes flickered down to my lips, my throat, the way my chest rose and fell too quickly. I didn't know if I was breathing too fast or not breathing at all. The air tightened between us, stretched too thin, as if the space itself was trembling under the weight of something inevitable. He took a step closer. I felt my back press against the door, felt the cool wood grounding me even as my knees weakened. He was too close now. I should have spoken, should have said something to shatter the fragile, pulsing tension. But then his fingers brushed mine. It wasn't an accident. Not this time. A deliberate movement, slow, testing, just the faintest touch, but it set every nerve in my body on fire. I didn't move away. Neither did he. Another brush, this time, his knuckles dragging against the inside of my wrist, as if recalling the moment in the study, the moment he'd held me there and neither of us had let go fast enough. Heat coiled in my stomach, spiraling outward. His voice came low, raw. Tell me to stop. I opened my mouth. I should have said it. Should have ended this before it began. I didn't. Because I didn't want to. The moment snapped. His hand lifted, fingers curling against my jaw, tilting my face up, until there was nothing left between us but the heat of our breath. And then, he kissed me. Not soft. Not hesitant. Not restrained. Like he'd been holding back for too long. Like there was nothing left to hold back. I gasped against his mouth, but he caught the sound, swallowed it, pressed deeper, harder. My hands found his shirt, gripping tight, pulling instead of pushing. I should have felt guilt. Should have felt fear. I felt alive. And then her voice. A sharp inhale. I wrenched away, breathless, pulse hammering against my ribs. She stood at the end of the hallway, watching, eyes wide, lips parted. And she didn't look away. Unexpected consequences. Time slowed, each heartbeat stretching the silence between us too thin, too fragile, ready to break. I should have said something. He should have said something. She should have run. But she didn't. She took a step forward. My breath caught. She wasn't angry. She wasn't horrified. She was curious. Her gaze flickered to him, then to me. Her fingers trembled slightly, not with fear, with something else. I should go, I whispered, voice barely more than air. But she took another step. And then, no. One word. A decision. A shift. Everything unraveled. I should have gone back to my room. Shut the door. Pretended the night never happened. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, my hand gripping the cold brass of my doorknob, my breath uneven. The weight of what I had seen pressed into me like a vice. His voice. Her silence. The look in their eyes. I should have walked away. I was about to, until I felt him behind me. Not touching. Not yet. But close enough that I could feel the heat of him. The presence that made the air in my lungs turn thick and heavy. My fingers twitched. I turned my head just enough to see him. His eyes locked onto mine. And suddenly everything else disappeared. There was no house. No walls. No time. Just this. This moment. This impossible, dangerous moment. I should have said something, but the words wouldn't come. And then his fingers brushed mine. Not an accident. A choice. I inhaled sharply, my body going rigid, but I didn't move away. Neither did he. The touch was featherlight, just enough for my skin to burn, for the air between us to tighten like a wire stretched too thin. His voice came low, raw, filled with something unspoken. Tell me to stop. My throat was dry. I should have, but I didn't, because I didn't want to. He exhaled slowly, like he had been bracing for something else. His fingers traced the inside of my wrist now, so light, so deliberate, so undeniable. I felt my pulse jump beneath his touch. A warning. Confession. The silence between us stretched, the moment teetering on a precipice. And then, as if the weight of restraint had finally shattered, he moved. His hand lifted, fingers tracing along the side of my jaw, slow, testing, deliberate. My breath hitched. He tilted my face up, until his lips hovered just above mine. I could feel his breath, warm and uneven, like he was holding back. And then, he wasn't holding back anymore. His mouth crashed against mine, rough, insistent, like he had been starving for this. The force of it sent a shock through my system. A jolt of something I couldn't name. I gasped, but he caught the sound, swallowed it, deepened the kiss like he wanted to pull the air straight from my lungs. My hands, I didn't even realize I was gripping him until my fingers curled into his shirt, pulling instead of pushing. His hands slid down my sides, fingers pressing into my waist, anchoring me, claiming me. I should have felt guilt. I should have felt fear. I felt alive. His other hand slid down my arm, slow and firm, like he was memorizing every inch of me. I shivered. I hated how much I wanted this. How much I wanted him. I felt his teeth graze my lower lip, a teasing edge of heat that sent a tremor through me. I gasped against his mouth, my grip tightening on his shoulders. His breathing was heavy now, like he was barely in control, like he had been holding back for so long that finally having me like this wasn't enough. I knew this was wrong. I knew. But I couldn't stop. And neither could he. Then just as suddenly, her voice. A sharp inhale. I wrenched away, breathless, my pulse hammering against my ribs. She was standing at the end of the hallway, watching. The world seemed to slow, sound fading into an unbearable silence. Her eyes were wide, her lips parted, but she wasn't moving. She wasn't angry. She wasn't horrified. She was curious. That scared me more than anything else. His breathing was still heavy, shoulders tense. He didn't move away from me, and she noticed. Her gaze flickered from me to him, like she was piecing together a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. I swallowed hard. My voice was barely a whisper. I should go. But she took a step forward. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something behind her eyes. Something dangerous. Something that made me forget how to breathe. And then, she said it. One word. A decision. A shift. No. Everything unraveled. She wasn't leaving. She wasn't stopping this. She took another step forward, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't. Instead, she looked at him, and he looked back. It hit me then like a freight train, like a sudden brutal realization that should have come sooner. I wasn't the only one who wanted this. She wanted it too. The moment hung in the air, undeniable, dangerous, forbidden. Her fingers twitched at her sides like she was hesitating, like she was deciding something that couldn't be undone. And then, she reached for me. A single cautious touch, a brush of fingertips along my arm, a mirror of what he had done just moments ago. I sucked in a breath, my body stiffening. She was testing me, testing us, and neither of us pulled away. Her touch lingered, slid lower. My stomach clenched, a slow burn igniting in my core. This wasn't just crossing a line. This was obliterating it. I felt his eyes on us, watching, waiting. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering against my ribs, my mind a chaotic mess of questions I didn't want answers to, because at that moment I already knew. We had already gone too far. And there was no going back. The air was thick, electric, charged with something we couldn't take back. She wasn't moving. Neither was he. Neither was I. The three of us were caught in the pull of something impossible. Something wrong. And yet I wasn't stepping away. No one was. She reached for me first. A slow, hesitant movement, like she wasn't sure if this moment was real. Like she wasn't sure if it was allowed. Her fingers brushed mine. Soft. Testing. Not an accident. Just like before, when his touch had burned through my skin, this felt the same. Deliberate. Inevitable. A silent question. And when I didn't pull away, everything snapped. She exhaled sharply, the last bit of restraint shattering in an instant. Her grip tightened. So did his. And suddenly we weren't frozen anymore. We were colliding. I felt it more than I understood it. This overwhelming, uncontrollable pull that shattered every rule I had ever known. No more hesitation. No more second-guessing. Just need. Hands. Lips. Heat. Everything blurred together. The feeling of her touch, his breath at my neck, the way my body moved before my mind could catch up. I gasped, but there was no air left between us. No space. No stopping. It was too late for that. We had crossed the line. And we weren't turning back. Emotional fallout. The moment exploded, then collapsed in on itself. The heat. The closeness. The sound of breathing still heavy in the room. Then silence. And it hit. The weight of it. The reality. I pulled back first, my pulse hammering so hard I thought my ribs might crack. What had we just done? I met his eyes, dark, unreadable, still burning. I turned to her, and saw the same fire there. No regret. No apologies. Just this undeniable, impossible truth between us now. We couldn't undo it. And worst of all, we didn't want to. The room was still. For a moment, everything was silent, too silent. I could hear my own breath, shallow and uneven. My chest rising and falling like the weight of the world had been placed there. My fingers still tingled from where they had touched her skin. From where his hands had moved over me. The memory of their heat lingered, burning into my bones. But now there was nothing but the coolness of the room. The heavy, suffocating silence that pressed in around us. It was as if the world had paused. And I was too afraid to breathe first. Neither of them spoke. She stood by the door, her back straight, eyes unreadable. But there was something in the way she stood. Something like anticipation, like she was waiting for something. Waiting for me. Waiting for him. His chest was rising and falling too. But he wasn't moving either. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at her. That realization hit me like a slap. I swallowed, the taste of him still in my mouth, the taste of something forbidden. Had we all crossed too far this time? Or was it something we couldn't stop, no matter how hard we tried? The minutes dragged on, the seconds heavy, thick with unspoken questions. I couldn't bring myself to speak. What was there to say? There was nothing but the weight of what we had done and the weight of what it meant. We had touched something that had no name. But somehow I could feel it growing inside me, the need to know, to understand what came next. I couldn't stop myself from looking at him. And he was still looking at her. For a moment it felt like a decision was hanging in the air. A choice we all had to make. Whether to acknowledge the chaos we had unleashed or walk away, and pretend it didn't matter. But I knew deep down that nothing could undo what had just happened. We had crossed too many lines. Her voice broke the silence. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forceful. It was barely a whisper. What happens now? Her words echoed between us, and I wasn't sure if she was asking me, asking him, or asking all of us. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't, because I didn't know what to say. But I could feel the question hanging there. The possibility. What was this? Was it just an accident? Was it just some twisted moment of passion we couldn't control? Or had we all been searching for something in each other? Something we couldn't even name, but we felt it anyway? And what did that mean for tomorrow? For the next week? I glanced at him again. He didn't meet my eyes. Not right away. Instead, he walked toward the window, his back turned to both of us, his hand on the cool glass. The faint moonlight illuminated his features, sharp, cold. Was he afraid? The question came to me with such force that it startled me. Had he made this choice in the heat of the moment? Or was he thinking of the consequences now? But he didn't say anything. And I didn't know what to say to him either. Because I wasn't ready to face the consequences. I wasn't ready to see what we had become, what we had done. But in the end, neither of us moved. Neither of us could move. We were all stuck here, bound together by something that shouldn't have happened, and yet we were still here. I didn't know if this was the end, or if it was just the beginning of something far more dangerous than I could imagine. Her eyes stayed fixed on him for a long moment before she finally turned to look at me. There was no anger, no disgust, just something calm, like she already knew what would happen next, like she had already made her peace with it. Her lips parted slightly as if she was about to speak again. But then she didn't. She just gave me one last look. One last look before she turned slowly and walked out of the room. She didn't look back. The door clicked softly behind her. And then there was only silence. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I could feel was the absence of everything that had been. And still neither of us moved. He was still by the window, staring into the dark. I was still standing there, my heart racing in my chest, wondering what had just happened, wondering what was next. I didn't know if I would ever have an answer. I didn't know if I wanted one. But I knew one thing. We had touched something we couldn't take back. And nothing would ever be the same again.